I'm sitting on my front porch now as I tell this story, looking at a lawn that's probably a little greener than it deserves to be. And every time I hear a mower somewhere down the street, I can't help but laugh because there was a time when half an inch of grass almost turned my life upside down. Or at least that's what my next-door neighbor wanted. Funny thing is, he thought he was teaching me a lesson about following the rules. But in the end, he accidentally reminded the entire neighborhood that rules only work when they apply to everyone. My name is Ethan Brooks, and until all this happened, I believed the smartest way to survive an HOA was simple. Keep your head down, smile at everyone, mow the lawn on Saturdays, and don't give anybody a reason to remember your address. I had lived in Oak Hollow Estates just outside Franklin, Tennessee, for almost 5 years, and honestly, it was peaceful. Kids rode bicycles until sunset, people waved while walking their dogs, and most disagreements ended with somebody bringing over a six-pack and talking things out. Then there was my neighbor, Dennis Calloway. Dennis had lived beside me longer than anyone else on our street, and somewhere along the way he stopped acting like a neighbor and started acting like the unofficial sheriff of the subdivision. He wasn't even on the HOA board at first, but once he joined the Community Standards Committee, something changed. Suddenly, every mailbox that leaned a little too far, every trash can left out an extra hour, every flower bed that looked slightly overgrown became a personal mission. He loved saying, "Rules don't have feelings," with this little grin that somehow made it sound less like a principle and more like a threat. The strange part was that nobody ever challenged him. People rolled their eyes, complained behind closed doors, then quietly paid whatever fine arrived in the mail, because arguing with Dennis always seemed to create 2 more problems. I figured I'd never end up on his radar. I work part-time entering public property records for Williamson County and spend the rest of my week restoring old furniture in my garage. I'm not exactly the loud neighbor, but sometime that spring I noticed Dennis standing at the edge of his driveway almost every evening, coffee mug in one hand, staring toward my yard a little longer than normal. At first, I assumed he was daydreaming. Then one afternoon I caught him taking pictures with his phone while pretending to check the weather. I waved. He didn't wave back. 2 days later, on a Friday, around 4 in the afternoon, I opened my mailbox and found my first violation notice. According to the inspection report, one section of my front lawn measured 4.5 inches, exceeding the community limit by exactly half an inch. $75 fine. I actually laughed because it sounded ridiculous. I walked outside with a tape measure just to see if maybe I'd missed something. Sure enough, near one sprinkler head, the grass had grown a little faster than everywhere else. Half an inch. That was it. I could have marched across the street and asked Dennis if he honestly had nothing better to do. But my dad always used to tell me, the quickest way to lose an argument with a difficult person is to become one. So I fired up my mower, trimmed the yard until it looked like a golf course, paid the fine online, and moved on. Or at least I tried to. 3 weeks later, another letter arrived. $100 this time. Same complaint. Same anonymous reporting party. Before touching the mower, I measured nearly every section of my yard myself. 3.75 inches. Not close to the limit. I even snapped pictures with my phone because something felt wrong. Still, the HOA upheld the violation without explanation. That's when the doubt started creeping in. Was I missing something? Or was someone making sure the measurements always worked against me? My friend Lisa from 2 houses down stopped by while I was standing in the yard staring at that notice. She looked at the paper, sighed, and quietly said, "You're not the first." Then she glanced toward Dennis's house before lowering her voice. "Just don't give him a reason to enjoy this." That sentence stuck with me more than the fine itself. Enjoy this, because suddenly I realized this wasn't about grass anymore. It was about somebody discovering that a little authority made them feel important. I wish I could tell you the second notice was the end of it, but about 2 months later, another envelope showed up with a $150 penalty for repeated violations. And as I stood there reading the words over and over, I noticed Dennis watching me from across the street with that same tiny smile. The kind that said he already knew exactly what was inside the envelope. At that moment, something inside me changed. I wasn't angry anymore. I was curious, because Dennis thought he understood the system better than anyone else in Oak Hollow Estates. But he had absolutely no idea what I had access to every single day at work. And for the first time, I started wondering what would happen if I stopped defending myself and started looking at the records instead. The following Monday, I walked into the county records office with that third violation notice folded neatly inside my backpack. And for the first couple of hours, I tried convincing myself to let it go. I answered emails, entered deed transfers, updated parcel records, all the routine work I'd done hundreds of times before. But every few minutes my eyes drifted back toward that folded piece of paper. It wasn't the money that bothered me. $325 wasn't going to ruin me. What kept eating at me was the feeling that someone had figured out how to bend a system that everybody else trusted. Around lunchtime, I finally stopped arguing with myself. Everything I had access to was public information. I wasn't looking for secrets. I was looking for patterns. So I opened the complaint archive, narrowed the search to Oak Hollow Estates, and started pulling reports from the previous 3 years. At first it looked like meaningless data. Addresses, dates, violation types, inspector assignments. But after about 30 minutes, something started repeating often enough that I leaned closer to the screen. One name appeared over and over as the reporting party: Dennis Calloway. 11 confirmed complaints against 6 different homeowners within 2 blocks of his house. Grass, trash cans, fence stained color, holiday decorations left up 3 days too long, a mailbox post that supposedly leaned 1 degree beyond acceptable tolerance. The man had practically turned reporting his neighbors into a hobby. Then I searched his address. Nothing. Not one inspection. Not one complaint. Not one warning. 3 full years without a single violation in a neighborhood where people regularly received letters over weeds or peeling paint. I frowned, thinking maybe he was simply perfect. But perfect neighborhoods don't exist. I drove home that evening without saying a word to anyone and intentionally slowed my truck as I passed Dennis's backyard. From the street, I couldn't see much. But from the walking trail behind our subdivision, the view was completely different. His back fence line hadn't been trimmed in weeks. Grass was easily 5 inches in several places, maybe more. Thick patches of weeds wrapped around the utility box. I pulled out my phone and quietly took several pictures, making sure the automatic timestamp stayed on. I didn't feel victorious. Honestly, I felt disappointed. I had spent months wondering whether I was somehow the careless homeowner everyone else avoided becoming, only to realize the loudest rule enforcer apparently believed the rules stopped at his property line. Over the next several evenings, I became patient. Every afternoon after work, I'd walk my dog through the neighborhood, greet whoever happened to be outside, and casually pass behind Dennis's lot. Each day, I collected another photograph. Different sunlight, different angle, same overgrown grass. Then, something even stranger happened. While sorting inspection schedules connected to public correspondence logs, I noticed several messages linked to committee communications. Most were harmless reminders about meeting dates or landscaping reviews, but buried between them were emails from Dennis requesting inspection priority adjustments. Move 214 Maple Ridge to Friday. Please revisit 214 Borteen Board of the weekend. My address. Again and again. None of those emails explicitly ordered anyone to find me, but they clearly showed he had been pushing the inspector to visit my property repeatedly while other complaints sat waiting. That crossed a line. I printed everything that was publicly available, organized it into a binder, highlighted dates, matched photographs with inspection reports, and built a timeline so simple even someone walking in cold could follow it. My dining room looked like a detective movie for 2 nights. My sister Emily stopped by to borrow a ladder and froze when she saw papers spread across the table. Either you're solving a murder, she joked, or somebody really made you mad. I smiled for the first time in weeks. I'm not trying to destroy anybody, I told her. I just want everyone playing the same game. She looked at the binder, nodded slowly, and said, "Then don't make this about Dennis. Make it about fairness." That advice stayed with me. The HOA's monthly open meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening inside the clubhouse by the pool. Usually maybe 20 residents showed up. That night there were closer to 40 because rumors had already started floating around that several homeowners planned to challenge recent enforcement decisions. Dennis stood near the coffee station wearing a pressed polo shirt with the committee logo stitched over the pocket, shaking hands like he was running for mayor. When our eyes met, he gave me that familiar smile. "Keeping the lawn under control these days, Ethan?" he asked loud enough for nearby people to hear. A couple awkward chuckles floated through the room. I smiled back. "Doing my best," I answered calmly. "You?" His grin tightened just enough for me to notice. The meeting dragged through budget updates, landscaping contracts, and pool maintenance before public comments finally opened. My heart was beating harder than I expected as I carried the binder to the front of the room. I wasn't nervous about speaking. I was nervous about what happened after people saw it. I'd like to discuss enforcement consistency, I began. Not Dennis. Not revenge. Consistency. I laid out the violation notices in chronological order, then the inspection dates, then the complaint logs showing 11 confirmed reports originating from one committee member against multiple neighbors. Murmurs spread across the room. Several people exchanged surprised looks. I continued without raising my voice. Public records also show this same committee member's property has not received a single inspection during the same period. One board member leaned forward. Are these official records? Every page is publicly accessible, I answered. You can verify every document independently. Then I placed the photographs beside the inspection reports. The dates matched perfectly. On 2 separate days, my lawn had supposedly violated community standards while Dennis's own backyard visibly exceeded them. Silence filled the room. You could actually hear the air conditioner humming. Dennis suddenly stood up so fast his chair scraped across the floor. Those pictures were taken from behind my property, he snapped. That's harassment. I looked directly at him. The walking trail is public. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then turned toward the board instead. He's abusing county resources. Before I could respond, Board President Carol Whitman asked quietly, "Did you access anything confidential?" "No, ma'am," I replied. "Only public complaint records available to every resident." Carol nodded once and looked toward the association attorney sitting against the wall. The attorney adjusted his glasses, flipped through several pages I had provided, then said the sentence that completely changed the room. "Based on what I've reviewed, these documents appear legitimate, and I recommend an independent audit of complaint activity submitted through committee member accounts during the previous 36 months. The room erupted. Homeowners who had barely spoken during meetings for years suddenly raised their hands all at once. Lisa stood and admitted she had received citations she believed were retaliatory. An older veteran named Harold mentioned multiple inspections arriving within days after disagreements with Dennis about parking. Another family described receiving repeated notices while Dennis's own property seemed invisible. None of them had proof before. Now they had context. Dennis kept interrupting, insisting everyone was overreacting, insisting he was simply protecting property values, insisting somebody had to enforce standards because lazy homeowners never police themselves. The more he talked, the worse he sounded. Finally, Carol called for order and requested a board vote. Every hand except one went up in favor of launching a formal audit. Dennis stared around the room as if he couldn't understand how quickly the atmosphere had shifted. For years, people had tolerated him because they thought he represented the rules. Now they were beginning to wonder whether he had simply been using the rules to represent himself. As residents slowly filed out of the clubhouse, Dennis brushed past my shoulder hard enough to almost knock my binder from my hands. He leaned close and whispered, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." I watched him walk into the parking lot without answering because something told me the real mistake had already been made. It just wasn't mine. Dennis's warning followed me home that night, but surprisingly it didn't keep me awake. What kept replaying in my head wasn't his threat. It was the look on everyone else's faces when they realized they hadn't imagined the pattern after all. For the first time since moving into Oak Hollow Estates, people who had quietly accepted one violation after another started talking to each other instead of just complaining behind closed doors. The next morning I poured my coffee, stepped onto the porch, and noticed Dennis wasn't standing in his driveway like he always did. His curtain stayed shut until nearly 10, which felt strangely symbolic. 3 days later, every homeowner received an email from the HOA announcing that an independent review of complaint procedures had officially begun and that, until the audit was complete, all Community Standards Committee members would temporarily lose the ability to request priority inspections. That single sentence probably upset Dennis more than any fine ever could because the one thing he enjoyed most wasn't enforcing the rules. It was deciding who the rules would be enforced against. About a week into the audit, something happened that made me laugh harder than it probably should have. A county inspection truck slowly pulled up in front of Dennis's house. Then another inspector walked around the side yard with a measuring stick exactly like the one that had appeared in my yard so many times. I wasn't spying. I was literally watering flowers when they arrived. Dennis came storming out his front door waving his arms. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "Somebody's targeting me." The inspector calmly answered, "Sir, we're responding to an inspection request generated through the current audit process." I almost smiled, but I caught myself. There wasn't any satisfaction in watching someone panic. There was only irony. The same system Dennis trusted when it pointed at everyone else suddenly felt unfair when it pointed back at him. Over the following month, the audit uncovered more than anyone expected. It wasn't some giant criminal conspiracy, and honestly, that made the story even more believable. There were no secret bank accounts or dramatic envelopes full of cash. Instead, investigators found something much more common: favoritism, selective enforcement, and a committee member who had repeatedly influenced inspection scheduling in ways he should never have been allowed to. Dennis resigned before the final report was released, saying he wanted to avoid distracting the community. Most people understood what that really meant. Shortly afterward, he submitted an application asking the board to waive a $400 permit fee for a fence replacement because, according to his letter, he had volunteered countless hours serving the neighborhood. The request was denied unanimously pending the outcome of the investigation. A few weeks later, the audit recommendations became official. Complaint submissions from committee members would now be automatically logged. Inspection requests would be assigned randomly instead of manually prioritized, and every board member's property would receive routine compliance reviews just like everyone else's. Nobody would be above the process again. That was probably the biggest victory of all, because it wasn't about me winning and Dennis losing. It was about making sure the next homeowner wouldn't have to stand alone, wondering whether they were crazy for questioning an obviously unfair situation. I still live in the same house today. My lawn is usually around 3.5 inches because, believe it or not, I actually do pay attention now. Every once in a while I'll see Dennis loading groceries into his truck or checking his mailbox. We nod politely, nothing more. The strange thing is, after everything that happened, he never once complained about my yard again. Maybe he realized how much damage one person's ego can do when it's wrapped in a rulebook, or maybe he simply understood that people eventually stop fearing someone the moment they start asking for proof instead of permission. Either way, the neighborhood feels different now. Kids still ride their bikes after dinner, neighbors still wave across driveways, but meetings are quieter because people know transparency has a funny way of calming everyone down. Looking back, I don't think this story was ever really about grass. It was about what happens when someone mistakes authority for ownership and forgets that fairness only means something if it applies equally to friends, strangers, and even ourselves. So now I want to ask you, if you had been in my position, would you have ignored the fines just to keep the peace, or would you have dug into the records the way I did? And if you were sitting on that HOA board, do you think Dennis deserved a second chance, or did he simply experience the consequences of his own actions? Let me know down in the comments because I'm genuinely curious where you stand. If you enjoyed this story and believe accountability should never depend on who you know, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who's ever had that one neighbor who thought the rules were written just for everyone else.